Good evening. We're going to be talking now a little bit more about Teddy Roosevelt's presidency. And when he's elected in 1904 for the first full term in his own right, he had been elected as vice president in 1900 as William McKinley's running mate. He wins a massive mandate in 1904. He gets almost 58% of the vote. And by the way, that's one of the highest popular vote totals in U.S. history. His cousin Franklin will beat it in 1936. Richard Nixon will beat that in 1972. And then Ronald Reagan will beat that in 1984. But nevertheless, it's in the top four highest popular vote totals, since the modern era. Now, he believes he has massive backing for his policies. I mentioned last time that there's a very conservative element within the Republican Party, and the Republican Party is split. There's the progressive wing, represented by Teddy Roosevelt, and the very conservative pro-Wall Street wing of the party. And very often those conservative Wall Street Republicans, supported by even more conservative Democrats in that era, will impede some of what Roosevelt wants to do. But he does get some elements of the progressive agenda. So to be clear, prior to this era, the era of laissez-faire, the U.S. government did very little. The U.S. government essentially delivered the mail, protected the shores, collected tariffs. It is tiny in the 1800s compared to what it is today. Roosevelt begins building, Teddy Roosevelt, the modern federal government and its relationship to the average person, and the number of responsibilities that the federal government takes to manage a complex economy, to protect consumers, to protect the environment, and so on. So, in this period, right when he gets elected, he's sworn in for a second term, 1905. 1906, there are a couple of typical progressive era bills passed that really reflect the new direction of the government in this era. The Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act, both of those are passed in 1906. And I referred to this writer before, but I'm going to remind you of what sets this up. So here's Teddy Roosevelt, the man of the hour here we're going to talk about. Teddy Roosevelt, again, the youngest person ever to become president. He's in his 40s then. This man is Upton Sinclair. Upton Sinclair was a socialist. He will actually run for governor of California as a socialist in the 1930s. Upton Sinclair is a journalist too. And he had covered the abuses, the mistreatment of the working class. And he becomes interested in the first years of the 20th century, in particular, in the conditions that are faced by all these immigrant workers in Chicago who are working at the city's extensive network of slaughterhouses and meatpacking plants. Chicago, famously, according to the poet Carl Sandburg, is hog butcher to the world. It's a city of big shoulders, referring to the workers in these slaughterhouses in the city. And many of them are Eastern European immigrants. So he decides he wants to find out what their lives are like. And he goes undercover as a reporter. And he wants to work and live amongst the meatpacking plant workers. Well, at some point, he decides he can tell a more emotional story, a fuller story, if he, instead of writing a nonfiction at work, if he writes a novel, which is published in 1906, called The Jungle. And he creates a fictitious character. Novels are works of fiction. Not all books are novels. Be sure you remember that. His hero in the novel is a Ukrainian immigrant named Yurgis Rudkus. And what he depicts is Rudkus and the other characters live in shabby housing where it's far too hot in the summer, dangerously cold in the winter. They of course have no access to health care. In one part of the book, his infant son dies basically from exposure and malnourishment. And he depicts the terrible working conditions, the unsafe working conditions, the exhaustion, the long hours, the starvation wages. And at the end of the novel, Rutgers embraces radical politics. And he quotes Karl Marx, where he's saying, "Workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains." And he's dedicated to the revolution. So Sinclair writes this novel, and his intention is to make the public horrified at the conditions of the working class and how they're abused. And he wants to raise in the minds of the readers questions about capitalism. That's not what the public begins to focus on, because in the book, he describes the condition of the meat that's processed there. He describes the fact that cattle, pigs, other animals are brought in to be slaughtered. Sometimes those animals are covered with tumors, on their skin, and that's processed along with everything else. Sometimes it's obvious the animals are ill. It doesn't matter. They're slaughtered. He talks about the meat being dropped on the very filthy floors of the slaughterhouses. He talks about how the blades aren't cleaned. And so you have meat that's decaying, that's mixed in with fresher meat. He talks about how the aprons and the other uniform of the slaughterhouse workers' work clothes aren't cleaned either. The gloves, none of that. He talks about how sometimes, because the blades are going really fast, sometimes the worker might lose a finger and it falls into the grinder, even a hand. And in fact, he hears a story that this supposedly happened before he worked there, and this is Upton Sinclair being a journalist. He just heard many people tell the story. It may have been a myth. That in fact, a worker fell into the grinder and was chopped up entirely himself, and there was no real effort to clean up the equipment after that happened. As regarding the animals, all the parts are used. He says the only part of the pig that's not used when it's packaged as meat sold to consumers is the squeal. So here's a picture of the very appalling conditions. Here's a typical meat packing plant from the year that this novel is published, 1906. It is widely read. In fact, it used to be a required book in high school. I read it as a required assignment when I was in high school. And so I want you to think a second. Do you think the public, when they read this novel, and many did, and by the way, the book became a story. Newspapers wrote about the book and what the book revealed. Do you think the public reacted to how meat packing plant workers were treated, their wages, their terrible housing, their terrible working hours? Or do you think they reacted to the sanitation involving the meat? Well, they went, ugh. They said, ugh, yuck. We have to clean this up. I don't want to eat that. I don't want to eat meat mixed with animal waste, meat mixed with diseased skin, etc., etc. And that's what the Congress responded to. And so they passed two laws the year the book came out, 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act, I'll mention drugs in a second, and the Meat Inspection Act. That aimed at giving the federal government the power to inspect meat packing plants, to inspect animals before they're slaughtered, to inspect practices of cleanliness in terms of equipment, the blades, the machines, the gowns and gloves that the slaughterhouse workers, all of that. Now, this is a dramatic expansion of government authority. The government is going into the workplace to protect consumers. Now, Upton Sinclair was going to be appalled. Not that he didn't want clean meat sold to the public, of course he did. But he wanted people to care about the workers who are providing food to the public. It's analogous, by the way, to the whole issue of not offering paid sick leave workers, or paid sick leave to workers at restaurants, people who deliver food. If they go to work sick, they're possibly contaminating the food you get. And so that is what was passed. Sinclair's reaction was, quote, "I aim for their hearts but hit their stomachs instead." And so that's, again, the progressives very often look at symptoms. You have an exploitive, terrible network of businesses that process meat, and they look at how horrible the meat is. They're not looking at the underlying disease of capitalist exploitation. And by the way, let's get back to this Pure Food and Drug Act. That also addresses the whole issue of patent medicines. We had talked about how the Rockefeller family made its money, and that John D. Rockefeller's father, William Avery Rockefeller, essentially peddled fake cures for cancer, that drugs were unregulated. A lot of the drugs that were sold as cures for cancer, heart disease, baldness, whatever, were filled with morphine, heroin, alcohol, and other substances. How Coca-Cola had been a medicine. It was loaded with cocaine. This begins to regulate that. It begins to require labeling of medications. And in fact, this lays a foundation for laws that later require that if you make a claim about a drug, you have to prove it. There has to be science behind it. You can't make false claims. By the way, that doesn't apply even today to natural substances. Those health stores, most of those items are not regulated at all because of lobbying by that industry. Nevertheless, so we began to have the government intervening, and this is part of the progressive view of government, what the role of it is, to protect consumers. Make sure your food is clean, your food is safe, and the drugs you take are safe. And so this is really an important step. And by the way, the government will begin with this foundation to outlaw certain substances. In the early 20th century is when you actually began to have laws passed to outlaw substances like heroin, cocaine, morphine, etc. Marijuana finally in the 1930s. I will observe that sometimes racism is involved in America's drug laws, and just note that in the 1930s when they were debating whether marijuana should be legal, what happened was there was testimony in Congress where people were accusing Mexican immigrants of bringing in marijuana, and this was actually in the testimony before Congress. They said that that Negro jazz musicians and Mexican immigrants, when they smoked grass, ended up having sex with white women, and that was one danger posed by marijuana. So anyway, we see a foundation for later anti-drug laws in the laws passed under Teddy Roosevelt's administration. Now, Teddy Roosevelt was, in many ways, he's a reformer, as I said. The progressives are not revolutionaries, but he is going to really represent a dramatic break on environmental policy. We have to be aware that as white Americans seize land from indigenous people, they see all that land as commodities. Land to be sold, land to be commercialized, to be used in agriculture. Native trees are plowed up. Native grasses are plowed up. Land is used for what's called monoculture, where they grow the same crop year after year after year. That depletes the nutrition of the soils. It causes soil erosion. All kinds of environmental damages caused. Lots of environmental damage caused by mining and other industries. And I mentioned this before. As a tactic of warfare against Native Americans, when the railroad lines spread throughout the West after the Civil War, they realized that many of the Western nations, Indian nations, were dependent on the buffalo for food, clothing. They used the fat for candles, for lighting, in other words. They had a number of uses for the buffalo. And what happened in that case is the railroads realized that Indians sometimes attacked railroad lines, because whenever white people showed up on railroad lines, Indians died and they lost land. So they wanted to get rid of Indians, so what they do? They would give firearms to passengers. And they'd stop the train. They said, do you want to have the experience of shooting a buffalo? And people would have these long rifles that were accurate at distant ranges. They'd shoot the buffalo, and then the train would move on. The carcass would be left there to rot. Part of the reason for doing that was to starve the Indians into going to reservations. And if they died, well, that was an added bonus in the minds of the railroad companies. I want to give you an idea. These are buffalo skulls. That's a mountain of buffalo skulls. That's how extensive the slaughter of buffalo was in the late 19th century. In fact, to the point that even though buffalo herds had once been so massive and extensive that they even reached modern-day Dallas-Fort Worth, and people in north central Texas said you could feel the ground shake like an earthquake from the number of buffalo. By the time we get to the 1890s, we're down to 500 or 600 buffalo, period. That's all that's left. Almost the extinction of one of the most remarkable species in the Western Hemisphere. Now, Roosevelt would not be considered necessarily an environmentalist by today's standards. He loved to hunt, and he loved hunting big game. Here's a picture of him with a rhinoceros. When he heard about the buffalo dwindling to numbers of near extinction, in fact, he said to a friend reportedly, he said, that's hunt one while they're still around. But as he gets older, he begins to really appreciate a fact that if you hunt species to extinction, they're not there anymore to hunt. That they can only be hunted if they continue to thrive and exist. That there is intrinsic value in a pristine river, a mountain that hasn't been destroyed for the coal inside or the gold or the silver inside, to a prairie with waving tall grass. That there's beauty in large species, and the government was going to have to intervene because various interests, such as the lumber industry, wanted uncontrolled access to forest to make products out of it. And they were rapidly destroying the forest in North America. Cattle merchants wanted access to public land taken from Native Americans to feed their cattle, and they were leaving the land bare. Mining industries wanted to denude mountains and destroy mountains. And by the way, one modern technique of coal mining is simply to blow up the top of the mountain. And they're doing that, and they're destroying the beautiful mountain ranges of West Virginia, and it will take a process of literally millions of years to return that to existence. So when Roosevelt became president, 45 million acres of public land remained. That's land owned by all of us. That was all that was left out of all the acres that had been taken by force from Native Americans. In the 7 years he's president, he triples that to, more than triples that, to 170 million. He creates wildlife preserves, natural parks, what are called national monuments. I want to show you one of these. The Muir Woods in California. Some of these places exist because of Teddy Roosevelt. He says at one point, quote, "Public rights come first, private interests come second." That's not a sentiment you hear very much today. He proposed and Congress approved the creation of the United States Forest Service. He does continue to allow some business exploitation of federal land, but he seeks unprecedented protection for rivers, forests, lakes, mountains, and habitats for endangered species. Now, this is going to cause a pushback. I said that there's a powerful part of the Republican Party in this era that is very pro-Wall Street, pro-business, and now that party's taken over the party entirely. But in that era, there were progressives like Roosevelt, and there were pro-business Republicans. So in 1907, the Congress is going to pass what's called an Appropriations Act. That's where the Congress considers all the revenues that have been taken through taxes, through park fees, through tariffs passed on foreign goods that are collected at ports, all the different revenue sources. And then they allocate them. They divide up the pie. This much for this department, this much for the Navy, this much for the Coast Guard, this much for the Postal Service, this much for whatever. Now, that's essential to the government running. Until the money's allocated, those departments for the coming fiscal year, financial year, don't have any funds. And so they passed this Appropriation Act, and in it, they attach what's called a rider. What's a rider? Well, there's a saying, and this will mean more after our discussion of the jungle. They say there are two things you should never watch being made: the law and sausage. So in this case, because both will turn your stomach, right? A rider is this, where you attach a piece of legislation that if it was on its own, couldn't pass. And you attach it to a bill that's really important, that has broad support. So let's say if there was a bill to provide increased funding for researching a vaccine for the coronavirus. And as part of that bill, they attached a piece of legislation that said, that included restrictions on abortion. That might not be able to pass the whole Congress, the abortion provision, but now it's part of a bill that deals with developing a vaccine for the coronavirus. If you vote against the bill, you're voting against the entire bill. You can't vote against pieces of the bill. And so now, if you vote against it because of the abortion provisions, then you'll be known as a person who didn't want a vaccine for the coronavirus. This is a way that unpopular ideas get through the Congress. So what did the Congress do in this case? They attached to this appropriation bill a provision that would ban the designation of any new nature reserves in 6 western states. So let me just get a map of the U.S. here. Give me a second. Let me just note that when I was living in California, one thing that was striking was that I would drive in Texas, when I was living in California, I drive to California. I was in the eastern third of California, and I'd get through that part. I'd drive across Arizona and New Mexico, and that would be 12 hours. And I would either reach the panhandle of Texas, or I would reach El Paso. And what happened then? Well, I said, okay, that's 12 hours. I'm in Texas, I'm home. Well, guess what? It took 12 hours to cross Texas. So I want you to look at this. So if you limit natural reserves in the western states, these are some of the biggest states in the Union. That's a substantial amount compared to, like, for instance, New England here. You are eliminating any ability to preserve natural sites, to protect species that are endangered in a substantial chunk of the United States. So this would be and Roosevelt is worried about the natural environment. He sees those lands and those species as part of the nation's heritage, part of its fortune, its wealth. And so he realizes politically he won't be able to successfully block the legislation. He can veto it, but the importance of the appropriations as a whole is so great that his veto will be overridden. So he uses executive orders. 10 days before that appropriations bill in 1907 becomes law, he uses executive action. He establishes 21 new nature reserves. He saves more than 16 million acres for parkland. And much of what you see if you tour, once life returns to semi-normal and you get to travel again, much of the beautiful land you're able to see, particularly in the West, is because of Teddy Roosevelt. So in style and substance, Roosevelt is going to break precedent with most of the quiet and mostly ineffective presidents of the 1800s. He's going to be the most powerful, assertive president in the United States since Abraham Lincoln died in 1865. Both Democrats and Republicans have been extremely friendly towards big business. The Republicans had been more likely in that era to support government spending and regulations. They're actually in that era to the left of the Democrats. That's reversed today. But nevertheless, both parties have powerful pro-business interests. He's able to contend with that. He commits himself to reform, however timid at times, and he sometimes sympathizes with labor. He was immensely popular. And there's no question if he had chosen to, in 1908, if he had chosen to, at that point, to run for a third term, he could have won it. Back then, there were no limitations at all on how many times a person could run for president, as we'll learn with Teddy Roosevelt's cousin, Franklin Roosevelt, in the 1930s and 1940s. But there was a tradition that was so powerful that even Teddy Roosevelt didn't think he could challenge it. That is, presidents in the United States don't run for third terms. Washington had served his first term. People had told him, yeah, I know you want to manage the plantation in Mount Vernon. I know you want to spend time with your wife peacefully, accumulating wealth. But you know what? You're the only person everyone agrees should be the first president of this new nation. The country will fall apart if you don't serve. So, okay, I'll serve a term in the White. Back then the capital split between Philadelphia and Washington. The White House didn't exist yet. And then at the end of that term, they say, you know what? Parties are already forming. There's one group that likes Alexander Hamilton and John Adams, Federalist. They hate the other group that's led by Thomas Jefferson. They're called the Republicans, a different Republican Party than we have today. This country will have civil war if you don't run again. You have to run for a second term. Washington says, oh my God, okay, yeah, one more term, that's it. I'm old. I want to be on the $1 bill. I want to have car sales in my honor. So he agrees to that second term. The second term is miserable. Second terms generally tend to be very bad for presidents. There's a sense that they've lost power once they win that second term, and you have presidents getting involved in scandals, very often like Nixon dealt with Watergate his second term, Clinton got impeached his second term, Lincoln had the worst one, he got shot, but anyway, same thing with McKinley. Second terms tend to be bad. But when Washington reaches the end of his second term, he's got all kinds of political problems, including the British and the French are kidnapping American sailors on ships. People don't like how he handled that. There are concerns about the economy, etc. So he has Alexander Hamilton write something that's published in newspapers called the Farewell Address, where he actually says, I am not going to run for a third term. I'm retiring. That's an important moment in American history, by the way, because it establishes the idea that presidents aren't president for life. And it does lead to a rotation of power, which was not the norm in the Western Hemisphere for most of the time since 1789 to actually the present, where we're beginning to see a resurrection of dictatorships in what's called Latin America. So the idea is this. Washington almost immediately was seen, in spite of being the fact he's a slave owner and other issues, he's seen as a demigod, a near god, the model of what a political leader should be. If Washington doesn't feel like he deserved, or he didn't feel like he deserved a third term, you'd have to be really arrogant to feel like you did. And so presidents, as a rule, didn't try. Grant hinted he wanted a third term. He kind of tentatively tried it, got shot down. And so this is in place. Roosevelt feels like he needs to agree to step down from the presidency, although he hates it because he wants to be president for the rest of his life. By the way, Franklin Roosevelt, a Democrat, who changes the Democratic Party on its racial policies, its economic policies, etc., will actually win 4 terms. He'll win his 4th term in November 1944. He's dying already when he wins that 4th term. And he will die, in fact, 1 month into his 4th term. And his Vice President Harry Truman ends up in the White House. Republicans were not happy with losing eventually 5 elections in a row, 4 of which were won by Franklin Roosevelt. Republicans pushed through in 1947 in the Congress. The Congress approves the 22nd Amendment, sends it to the states, and the required number of states, the 3/4 of the states, ratify it in 1951. So presidents are now limited to 2 terms. A president who assumes the White House, the office of the presidency, because of the death, resignation, or disability of the president or the impeachment of a president, can serve up to 10 years if it's less than half the previous president's term. So, just up to 1 day short of 10 years. That's less than half. Then you can serve that period of time. So you can serve almost 10 years, but that's it. Well, Roosevelt doesn't feel like he can serve that next term. So he hopes his policies will be promoted by a friend, William Howard Taft. William Howard Taft was a former federal judge. He had been appointed by William McKinley, Roosevelt's predecessor, as military governor of the Philippines after the U.S. took control of the Philippines during the Spanish-American War. And by the way, there was a mass slaughter of Filipinos rebelling against U.S. rule while Taft was in that position. Taft is, unfortunately for Roosevelt, a much, much more conservative president. And he's got some political handicaps. Teddy Roosevelt was an extremely difficult act to follow. As I said, he's up like 20 hours a day. He's reading 3 books a day. He's always in the middle of every single political controversy. He's at the forefront. He's pushing legislation. And he's a real believer in the concept of progressive government, progressive politics. A force of nature, swimming. Yeah, I mean, he's a stocky guy, but he's also an athlete. That's not true of William Howard Taft. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying this as an act of sizeism, but it's relevant to his political fortunes. Taft, next to Roosevelt, following Roosevelt, is not going to measure up in the public's mind and esteem. Taft, at his peak, weighs 340 pounds. You see him here. He's the largest man to ever be president. There is a cruel, what you might call urban legend, never been actually verified by hard facts, that he got stuck in the White House bathtub. That's a story, but that tells you what people think. I was actually at the Mission Inn in Riverside, California in 1995, 25 years ago. I just passed my master's comprehensive exams, and I spent a weekend there at the inn to celebrate. And I found there, I didn't know it was there, a chair that was custom made for William Howard Taft. You see it here. I was smaller than Taft, and I was smaller than I am now today. There I am. I was 35 at that point. So anyway, that's the special Taft chair. Why is that relevant? He was seen as a sluggish, unenergetic, and unimaginative person, and a disappointment after Roosevelt. He lacks Roosevelt's charisma and energy and determination, and he frustrates Roosevelt on policies. Roosevelt believes that we should have a reduction on tariffs, taxes on foreign-made goods, because he believes that that will make American businesses compete and produce better products more efficiently. Taft is a creature of big business. He supports high tariffs. Taft also greenlights, supports a greater use of public land by corporations. So it's only 2 years into Taft's term, dissident Republicans, rebellious Republicans began begging Roosevelt to seek the presidency again. And believe me, Teddy Roosevelt doesn't need much encouragement. And so he says this, he writes to his son, he says, Taft is utterly hopeless as a leader. And he goes on a national speaking tour. Presidents aren't supposed to do this. Even today, this is considered bad form for a former president to criticize a current president. It's been remarkable how little Barack Obama has said about the man in the White House now. But that's a long-standing tradition that when you're out of power, you step aside and you let the new leader take control. He goes on a speaking tour and he begins criticizing the man who had been his friend, Taft. And actually, he's starting a presidential campaign, which leads us to 1912. One of the more interesting presidential elections. There are going to be 4 major candidates that year, and I'll explain how. Roosevelt challenges Taft for the Republican nomination. The party leadership was never overly fond of Roosevelt. And they say, we have an incumbent president, Taft, who's running for re-election. The American tradition is, if the incumbent president wants another term, the party supports him. Plus, Taft was more conservative, and the Wall Street wing likes that. So they back Taft, and in spite of the fact that Roosevelt wins a small number of primaries that were available then, where voters directly choose who they want to be the nominee, they set up the process so Taft gets renominated. Well, Roosevelt has lost, right? He didn't get the Republican nomination. So that's going to stop Roosevelt, right? No, not at all. It's Teddy Roosevelt. So he forms his own political party. He says, the hell with that. I'll form a party, and this party is essentially a vehicle for him to run for president for. It's going to exist this one time. It's called the Progressive Party. It more famously becomes known as the Bull Moose Party because, reportedly, Roosevelt is as strong as a bull moose. And they're going to challenge Taft, Roosevelt, as a nominee of the Progressive Party. Please note the name of the party. Progressivism is now a real solid force. Now, the Democrats, of course, are going to be in the election. And I've said this before, you have 48 years between 1860 and 1912, 12 presidential elections where the Democrats, who were still blamed by many for the Civil War, and are seen as the party of treason. In those 12 elections, they win exactly twice. But they have a shot now because Roosevelt's followers are Republicans who are unhappy with Taft. The Republican Party is split. And so the Democrats have a real solid opportunity. So we have the Democrats hold a convention, and it's a bit of chaos because of party rules in the Democratic Party. In the 1830s, when the modern Democratic Party formed, and Andrew Jackson was the president. Andrew Jackson was a Tennessee slave owner. They adopted rules so the southern states could veto any nominee. They wanted to make sure the South had the final word on whoever the Democratic nominee was in a presidential election. So to win the nomination at the National Convention, you had to get 2/3 of the delegates at that point. This rule won't be changed until Franklin Roosevelt's president. That meant that Democratic nominees tended to be, before the Civil War, pro-slavery, after the Civil War, pro-Klan, end of Reconstruction, pro-poll taxes, literacy tests, etc. Now, this makes it very hard to win the Democratic nomination. They end up nominating, in 1912, an unusual candidate. It takes 46 ballots, but they end up nominating a bookish, very often emotionally aloof, distant person, Woodrow Wilson, to top their ticket. So Woodrow Wilson is an illustration of a principle that I hold very deep in my heart, and that is present company excluded. History professors should never be president. So let's talk about Wilson. Wilson's unique, and his background actually gives him an advantage in this race. He's one of a kind. He's a son of a Presbyterian minister. He's born in a southern state, Virginia. He grows up in another southern state, Georgia, and also North Carolina. But, and here's what's important. When it's time for Woodrow Wilson to go to college, he goes to a college in New Jersey, actually a university in New Jersey. And he builds his adult life there. He gets an undergraduate degree from Princeton, part of the Ivy League. And after a brief law career, he studies political science and history, and he earns his PhD from Johns Hopkins University, which is in Maryland, which is a state on the border of the North and South. Culturally, for much of its history, Maryland's been a southern state, but it's sort of transitioning into a greater orientation towards the North. He's appointed to teach at Princeton in 1890. He becomes president of that university. Let me explain that while he's at Princeton, he writes histories of the United States that take a very racist interpretation of the Civil War and Reconstruction that is apologetic towards the Confederates. And that'll be relevant later. But anyway, he becomes president of Princeton in 1902. And he gains a great national reputation as a reformer because of several practices he ends at that university, such as what was called the Gentleman's See. It had been traditional at that college that if a student came from a wealthy family, particularly one that had gone to Princeton, their father or grandfather, whatever, that you were guaranteed that you would never get less than a C in any course. He abolishes that practice. Also, there was a system, a very rigid class system at Princeton. And so there were special eating clubs that were available only to students from wealthy families. He abolishes that. He says we're going to have common eating areas. Students from wealthy families, students from middle-class families, etc. They're all going to sit at the same dining hall. Well, guess what? He makes a lot of rich alumni really mad. And in fact, he's going to be in the process of being pushed out as president of that university at that point. But the Democrats notice he retires as Princeton president because of the unpopularity on the hand of the alumni. The Democrats encourage him to run for governor of New Jersey. So here's a Southern man who's going to be nominated. He's going to win the governorship of a northern state. And once he's governor, he rules as a progressive, like Roosevelt. He pushes the legislature to pass a workman's compensation law. These laws guarantee that if you're injured at work while performing duties related to your work, that the company will help provide health care for you, pay for it. And he creates a commission to regulate utilities, like electric companies, and how much they can charge customers. So Wilson then decides 2 years into his governorship to run for president. And here's the circumstance he has. Not only is he an eloquent speaker, a passionate speaker, he's a professor, he's used to speaking at length to the public, but he's also got this unique thing, that he is a Southern man who had been a Northern political leader. He bridges the differences between regions in a country that had been very badly divided. So, and he's going to run against a party that normally dominated politics, but is split in two. So Wilson, like Roosevelt, is going to run on a progressive platform. And he's going to try to appeal to various diverse constituencies. The farmers, he says, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to lower tariffs. We put tariffs on manufactured goods from Europe, so they're more expensive than American-made ones. That helps big business. But also the Europeans put tariffs on the crops you grow. So if I do that, if I lower tariffs, guess what? You're going to be selling crops and other products to Europe. To labor, he says, one thing I'm going to do for you is I'm going to stop asking courts to issue injunctions, orders that command that you stop your strikes and go back to work. I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm going to stop using antitrust laws against labor unions. And to small business, he says this: I'm worried about the trust, just like Teddy Roosevelt was. I'm going to make sure there's honest competition, that big business doesn't swallow your small business. And that's, this ends up being appealing to a lot of voters. So we have these three candidates I mentioned: Taft, the incumbent running for another term; Roosevelt, a former president who was really popular, running as a third-party candidate; and Woodrow Wilson. And then on top of that, a socialist candidate who's going to set a record for his following, who's going to be on the ballot too, Eugene Debs. We've talked about him before. Taft is a hopeless candidate. He runs on the slogan, quote, "It's better to be safe than sorry." Roosevelt is going to actually set a record for a third-party candidate. He's going to finish in second place. He's going to finish ahead of the incumbent. He's going to get 27.4% of the vote, ahead of Taft. Taft finishes third. That had not happened to an incumbent president since John Adams in 1800. This split, and by the way, Debs gets around 6% of the vote. This split allows Wilson to win a majority of the Electoral College, even though he only gets 43% of the popular vote. 6 out of 10 people vote against Wilson, Wilson will rule like he got 60%. We'll talk about him next time.